Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 36, From Knowing to Growing, the Hallowed Cathedrals of Learning, on how knowledge met structure and system, ubiquity and universality. Over the last few episodes in our story, we followed various movements and developments that worked towards the spread and sharing of knowledge, a key component in the story of innovation and progress, most notably in the synthesis of Indian, Greek and Persian knowledge by the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age in episode 33, and then its translation into Europe via Muslim Spain in the follow-up episode 33b. Let's now look at what's perhaps the most outstanding and long-lasting crystallization and culmination of all these forces.
But first, what are our friends up to?
Steve, Brian, Brenda, and Irene are sat around the table looking rather worried. Bruno the dog has not been keeping well lately. His appetite has fallen, looks somewhat weak, and he's usually in a dour mood, moping. They have tried everything. It's almost like a dog version of the Confuse a Cat venture in Monty Python. Look it up later. The problem is that there is a sort of dog flu going around town, afflicting many other dogs as well. So much so that the Duke has offered a hefty reward to anyone who comes up with a solution, a lasting and convincing solution. So yes, while there is foreboding, there's also this sense that there is opportunity here. In the midst of the silence, Steve's face lights up. Yes, I know it. I'm going to read up all the books on the matter of medicinal treatments and identify the solution. Brian, not to be outdone, retorts, actually, I know an even better way. I'll build it myself. Bruno sat in the corner, releasing a whelp, but Iris the cat perking up that something interesting is going to happen. So over the next few days, Steve is away with his head buried in all the books he can find, making notes, sketches, and a pile of discarded crumpled paper enough to represent a small forest. Meanwhile, Brian is in the garden, plucking out different leaves, mixing seeds, concocting all sorts of concoctions. Brenda and Irene are initially encouraged by this spirit, but then start to wonder if this is the way to go about things. And after what seems like ever, Steve emerges from his study looking triumphant. Folks, I've done it. I got it. And then looking at Bruno, he's like, you know what, buddy? What you need is a little drink of 3 parts of Digestifix tailwaggis mixed with 2 parts of Wufenol concentrate, along with exactly 3.7 units of Antimop infusium, lightly heated to the exact temperature of. That's when Irene loses her patience. Steve, come on, don't be silly. How can Bruno go about and make its own medicine? Even we cannot make sense of what you're saying. All those fancy terms? Steve is like, come on, Irene, this is what I've gathered from my extensive research. This is from those great books going back to Galen himself. And then there's Brian. He's got all these different herbs and other plant material. He's like, yeah, I know the answer. It's this fuzzy purple one mixed with that slightly stinky yellow stuff and that leafy green boy and this. You know the plots by now. This time Brenda erupts. Come on, Brian, you don't even know what those plants actually are. And true to form, Brian is like, no, Brenda, look, the color is changing in the mixture. I know this is going to work. More whelps from Bruno and Iris starting to look more and more bemused. And that's when, exasperated, Brenda and Irene drag them both out to the garden table, almost as if by their ears, sit them down and say, look, that's not how you do it. Both of you might have some merit in your approaches, but Steve, you don't even know if your thing is going to work practically. And you, Brian, for heaven's sake, don't even know the names of the stuff you're talking about. and then they decide to lay out the ground rules. Brenda's like, look, guys, tomorrow morning, each of you will bring to the table your ideas, your approach, and the path to the solution you propose. The rest of us will have the right to ask questions, raise questions, and so on. Irene intervening. Firstly, we'll lay out the exact problem in full detail so that when each of you provides your argument, we will assess that against the matter in question. And then they tell the guys, once you've made your argument and we've had the debates, the two of us will look into the soundness of your case, and then we'll proceed to actually testing it in practice, if deemed convincing. As you can expect, Steve and Brian protest vociferously. Come on, this sounds like a convict's trial. What's all this question and argument got to do with any of this? But eventually, they come to agreement. After all, when presenting their solution to the Duke and Co., which is likely to be a combination of their efforts, they'll have to demonstrate that it works and be able to convince the wider community why they're confident it works. More importantly, they don't want to try out something that might harm Bruno and make things worse. Iris the Tat pauses its mouse hunt to give an approving nod. Even Bruno looks up with a rare gleam in his eye. A flickering flame in the dark. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, cats and dogs, welcome to the university. With the above story, I'm illustrating one of the very cornerstones of what led to the rise of the university, and potentially, as a consequence, much else that's good and we cherish in modern life. But first, let's get some background. In the first article about Rome, episode 30, and its post-mortem piece, episode 31, we explored the massive changes to society that followed the disintegration of Roman imperial power in Western Europe. In these and later episodes, we've touched upon how the Roman Church, having stepped into the power vacuum, essentially became the successor of the Roman Empire, and at the very least, in one area, it had a monopoly: education, or broadly, writing and the dissemination of learning and literature. My previous statements on this last point might come across as rather negative, especially in light of the fact that a lot of that early period is termed the Dark Ages by historians, but also perhaps because we were discussing matters from the perspective of the state of affairs in European classical antiquity, e.g., episode 30b, or the desire to revive that glorious past, episode 34, and in light of the Church's priority being theological matters rather than secular. However, there were efforts in earnest, even in what may be called the early Middle Ages, roughly between years 500 and 1000, to build a systematic approach to education under the aegis of the Church that would work across Christendom. Notable names in this regard are Pope Gregory the Great, Boethius, Cassiodorus, and Saint Benedict, all in the 500s. The four horsemen post the Roman apocalypse, you say? The resultant structures were what are called monasticism and then scholasticism. Check footnotes for specifics about each of these people, etc. Of these, monasticism, the older movement, was concerned primarily with the preservation of knowledge, whereas, as we'll see, scholasticism evolved to expand the concern to the production and expansion of it. Growing pains, growing gains. Owing to a combination of factors, population and thus urbanization began to rise around the turn of the millennium, one reason being global warming, which, as we have seen in episode 21, has time and again led to better crop growth and population. Thus, while after the fall of Rome in the West, urbanization severely receded in most parts, the trend reversed in the new millennium, aided by technological improvements, which meant there was starting to be a greater demand for knowledge as economic activity increased in such a benign environment. Thus, in about year 1100, after a transitional period during the Carolingian Renaissance in previous centuries, shout out to Alcuin of York, the scholastic approach began to supersede the monastic one, with the aforementioned shift in focus, accompanied by a growing emphasis on greater rigor. I mean, lone monks in a hilltop monastery copying out works in candlelight was not going to cut it, was it? But there was another development that was a more impressively massive shock to the system.
The golden crescendo in full flood.
Yes, you guessed it. This is the sudden availability of ancient Greek texts, but also Indian and Persian ones, along with the Arab synthesis and expansion of all of these, as we've traced in full detail in those 2 articles. I have discussed the sheer magnitude of the intellectual achievement and content in those pieces, but it's not hard to imagine what a huge systemic shock it was. The rediscovery of ancient Greek texts, including those of Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, and especially Aristotle, coming in from Arab sources, not only simply translated from Greek to Arabic, but with copious commentaries and annotations by Islamic scholars such as Ibn Rushd, Averroes in Latin, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna in Latin. The rediscovery of Roman law, Emperor Justinian's comprehensive legal code, now the basis of the legal system in continental Europe. The discovery of vast new content, including sophisticated natural philosophy, metaphysics, systematic jurisprudence, and as we've seen in episode 32, algebra, along with other advanced mathematical concepts, including the Indian numerals with the zero, sine, cosine, etc., episode 28. Just think of someone with an old vinyl and no other music being given a Spotify premium account with access to everything.
From faint flicker to fiery flame.
The scholastic system was ultimately not capable of handling this flood of knowledge, and all alongside the rising demand and hunger for it. It was the convergence of these factors that resulted in what comes to be called the university, or in Latin, universitas. The most notable names here would be Bologna, year 1080, Oxford, 1096, Sorbonne, 1150, and Cambridge, 1209. There are, of course, so many illustrious names, but these are among the earliest names, with Bologna, Oxford, and Cambridge still operational to this day. A key organizational innovation of the university was its autonomous institutional makeup. It was constituted as a corporation, akin to a guild, a concept I'll return to, which gave it independence from the political and religious currents of the day, and in particular academic freedom. From the earliest days, while kings and popes granted university charters, the university had such autonomy and legal protection, including rights and privileges codified in law. Apart from such legal setups, another aspect worth noting is the operational rigor. The pursuit of knowledge was buttressed on principles such as disputatio, which is what we see enacted by our fictional friends above. The importance of this cannot be overstated. Without the rigor of elements such as proposing a quaestio, a problem, and systematic ways of carrying out the disputation and arriving at the solution, how can all aspects of a subject matter be rationally and reasonably assessed? And finally, there is the principle of ius ubique docendi, the right to teach everywhere, ubiquitously, making for a widely recognized credential system.
From ubiquity to universality.
All this meant that the university was a package, a template that can be easily adopted in a different place with all the ingredients: the autonomy, academic freedom, rigorous processes such as disputation, and the ubiquitous applicability. It was a sort of plug-and-play mechanism that could therefore also scale, as it did first within Europe and eventually across the whole world, right to this day. Many of the developments of innovation I've discussed in recent episodes may or may not have a direct bearing in our daily lives. They may be superseded by other innovations on top that came later. But this is one medieval innovation that we cannot escape. Most of us are the product of a university education, or at least we may be surrounded by them. The vast majority of the great figures in history may be counted as products of fine universities. We may even conclude that the institution of the university was one of the greatest epistemological innovations in all history. In this account, I've only touched upon some of the basic characteristics of this institution. I've only skimmed the surface in a simplistic manner within the constraints of a single article such as this, and thus I fear I've not done enough justice to it. Still, I suppose making us pause and think about this ubiquitous, still alive phenomenon and its origins is a start. The university arose at a time when, you might say, faith was more important than reason. We like to think that we now live in an era where reason has prevailed over faith, and other devices we dismiss as irrelevant or unimportant. But have we kept with the rather extraordinary tenet of the university, which inculcated reasonable, necessitated debate even at a time when faith subjugated reason? And also, let's further pause to ask ourselves how much of that intellectual and institutional autonomy, that academic freedom, whatever the political, ideological forces of the times, has been still retained in our universities. How much do we still hold ourselves to those same rigorous standards of the disputatio, civil, curious, and open-minded, two-way, evidence-based, pro and con debate, discussion and discourse, without excluding or stigmatizing anyone on the basis of their beliefs, opinions, or propositions, in resolving the conflicts and issues that beset us in the modern day?